The Dust Bowl era was one of America's toughest times, but people still had to keep their tummies full. Here are 20 foods that kept folks going through this challenging period, and you'll be surprised to see how creative people got with their meals. Let's start with a Dust Bowl classic, canned tumbleweed leaves. So, the Dust Bowl was one of the worst agriculture disasters the United States has ever seen, and almost no crops grew. But even in these tough times, weeds like lamb's quarters and tumbleweeds continued to thrive. Families had no choice but to add this plant to their plates. Think of it as the broccoli of the 1930s. Kids weren't big fans of this meal option, but it did provide a good amount of fiber, minerals, and vitamins. Tumbleweed leaves were added to all kinds of different stews and soups. They might have not been the most glamorous ingredient on the shelf, but they got the job done by providing nutrients and keeping tummies full. When you think of popcorn, the Dust Bowl era is probably the last thing that comes to mind. Popcorn is the comfort food of the movie theaters, but believe it or not, they were still all the rage back in the 30s when options were limited. During the Dust Bowl, these crunchy snacks took on a whole new role. Yes, they paired popcorn with milk back then, and it became the combo of our dreams. When milk was available, it was poured over freshly popped popcorn to turn the snack into a whole meal. Milk was scarce, so it wasn't always available, but when it was, this meal was everyone's go-to. Popcorn was a cheap and easily accessible grain, and milk, if you were lucky enough to have some, added a bit of protein and calcium. It might not be your first choice for a fancy dinner, but it was a clever way to make do with what was available. Speaking of food combinations, this next one will definitely blow your mind. Have you ever thought of combining beef with gelatin? If not, this is your sign to twist things up a bit and try this one out. There's a reason why this one was the talk of the town during the dirty 30s. The gelatin was used to thicken soups and stews, while the beef added a hint of protein. Now, since the supply was always limited, don't expect a whole beef steak in your bowl. Just a few chopped up bits and pieces of meat, and every few bites was all you got. This meal was designed to be full, and it was left bland for the most part. However, some people in the South decided to spice things up a bit by remixing the recipe according to their likes. One such recipe included canned corned beef, canned peas, gelatin, lemon juice, and vinegar. We wouldn't consider pairing these ingredients today, but it was a lifesaver for those who had to make it through the hard times. Carrot marmalade came to the rescue when gelatin and popcorn weren't doing much for the taste buds. Now, marmalade usually involves citrus fruits, but during the Dust Bowl, folks had to get creative. This was a pairing that ensured nothing went to waste in the kitchen, including carrots that had slightly gone bad. This wasn't just a treat, but it was a way to preserve the sweetness in fresh fruits and vegetables because fresh produce was hard to come by. This marmalade was made by boiling carrots with sugar and a bit of lemon juice, creating a spread that could be used on bread or biscuits. Plus, carrots are packed with nutrition. Carrots are packed with antioxidants like beta-carotene and lutein. These compounds have protective effects against oxidative stress and inflammation. Now, I don't know if you've ever thought of eating a dandelion fresh from the fields, but our ancestors have done it all for us. Yeah, dandelion salad was a staple during the Dust Bowl era. Since there were no fancy crops to harvest, dandelions had to do the job, and they did it pretty well. People would harvest the dandelion greens and toss them in a salad. Now, I'm not saying it would win any Michelin stars, but hey, it provided some vitamins and roughage, which is more than you can say about canned tumbleweed leaves. To make dandelion salad, the leaves were washed and mixed with whatever other ingredients were available, things like onions, radishes, and even bits of bacon if you were lucky. Believe it or not, this salad was actually tasty, or at least that's what I've heard. I guess we'll have to try it ourselves to know for sure. Cornbread was one of the most popular sources of carbohydrates back in the day. Since there wasn't much food available, this one was a reliable provider of instant energy and kept folks fueled through the toughest days. Cornbread was versatile too. It could be served with just about anything, from a hearty bean soup to a simple stew. It was the kind of bread that could stand up to the most basic of meals and still make them feel a bit more complete. Plus, it was easy to make in large batches, which was a huge plus when feeding a family when pockets were tight. This was a staple during the Dust Bowl because cornmeal was cheap and filling. You could whip up a simple cornbread loaf, fry up corn fritters, or even make mush. Who doesn't love the aroma of a good homemade casserole? Well, this hearty meal was still winning hearts even during the Dust Bowl days. Now, during the Dust Bowl, casseroles weren't the fancy, cheesy concoctions we know today. They were more like a hodgepodge of whatever was on hand. Leftover vegetables, some mystery meat, maybe some canned beans, all thrown together in a baking dish. Not exactly Instagram-worthy, but it was a way to use up scraps and fill up the dining table. Plus, they were the stars of potlucks and holiday dinners. This was the era of coming up with all different recipes for casseroles and everything from hash brown casseroles to tuna noodle casseroles. These recipes were passed down from generation to generation and made their way to us. Casseroles were the kind of dish that brought people together, not just because they were filling, but because they were often made with love and shared with family and friends. They were a reminder that even in the hardest of times, people found ways to come together and enjoy a meal. Now, if you think baking a cake without eggs, milk, or butter sounds impossible, think again. During the Dust Bowl, people got creative with their baking. This egg-free, milk-free, and butter-free cake was made with simple ingredients like flour, sugar, and vegetable oil. It was impossible to live without cake even in times of desperation, so people decided to make do without the fancy ingredients. Now, I know eggs, milk, and butter don't sound fancy to us, but these ingredients were a luxury to find during the Dust Bowl days, and even if you did find some, it was never enough to whip up a whole cake. The cake might not have been as rich as its traditional counterparts, but it was a sweet treat that offered a bit of comfort during difficult times. We've got one thing straight: meat was scarce during the dust storm era, so jackrabbits became a surprising alternative. These nimble critters were abundant in the wild, and they provided a valuable source of protein. Jackrabbits were often stewed or roasted, and its meat was said to be quite flavorful when prepared correctly. Jackrabbits, those long-eared critters that seemed to hop faster than a speeding bullet, became a potential meal. I'm not sure how they caught them, but I imagine it was a wild chase through a dust storm. Cooking jackrabbit was more of a skill than creativity, and preparing this dinner was a labor of hard work as it was a lean meat that needed to be tenderized and seasoned well, but when done right, it was totally worth it. What's not to love about a 3-ingredient delicious sauce? White sauce was the comforting meal you look forward to coming home to every night. It was a break from the bland foods of the dirty 30s, and the best part? It required just 3 common ingredients that were already staples in everyone's kitchen: flour, butter, and milk. This sauce is like an easy breezy addition of the bechamel sauce, which is one of the mother sauces of French cuisine. This sauce is made from a white roux and milk, seasoned with ground nutmeg. Since we didn't have fancy ingredients on hand, the simple ones did the job. This sauce was used to top pasta, vegetables, casseroles, and even lasagnas. If you were lucky enough to have a bit of cheese in your pantry, it could be turned into a cheesy sauce. If you had some herbs, it could be seasoned to add extra flavor. And let's be honest, in tough times, a little creamy sauce can make everything taste just a bit better. Now, bacon grease might seem like a strange thing to highlight, but hear me out. In a time when oil was scarce, bacon grease was like liquid gold. It was used for everything from frying potatoes to greasing pans. And let's be honest, it adds a flavor boost to just about anything. Can you imagine making biscuits with bacon grease? Oh, it was good. Bacon was one of the few adorable meats during this time, and it left behind grease, which was way too good to just toss out. Now, I know this bad boy has no nutritional value, but sometimes all you need is a little flavor in your life, and it's fine to have cheat days sometimes, right? So, while it might not be the healthiest option, it certainly helped to make those Dust Bowl meals a little more enjoyable. Mildred Armstrong Kalish lived in Iowa during the Great Depression. She recalls cooking with bacon grease, which she called her family's Tuscan olive oil. So, pickling was a common practice during the Dust Bowl, and when you're not sure whether you'll wake up to a fresh harvest of fruits, preserving them is the way to go. And what's a better way of preserving fruits than pickling them? I mean, you could dehydrate nature's sweets, but picking is a whole lot tastier. Pickling involves soaking fruits in a mixture of vinegar, salt, and spices. Fruits like apples, peaches, and even cherries were pickled with sugar and vinegar to create a sweet and tangy treat that could last throughout the year. These pickled fruits were often enjoyed as a side dish or used to add a bit of sweetness to other meals. It's crazy to think that pickled fruits were one of the only sweet treats available during the Dust Bowl era. Remember when I said cornmeal was dirt cheap during the Dust Bowl era? Plus, it was almost everywhere, especially if you lived in Missouri or Kansas. Well, cornmeal mush was something Meemaw made every time we needed a nice, fulfilling meal. Think of it as the instant oatmeal of the Dust Bowl days. You just cooked cornmeal in water until it reached a thick, porridge-like consistency. It was often served with a pat of butter or a sprinkle of sugar. Some folks even added a little molasses for extra flavor. Cornmeal mush was an affordable way to keep hunger at bay and provided a good source of energy. It wasn't a five-star meal, but it was dependable, much like the comfort of a warm blanket on a cold night. Meats and chicken were too expensive, so people had to make do with veggies like corn. Now people who had chickens as pets had the luxury of eating hard-boiled eggs for breakfast. Let's be honest, we all love a sunny side-up, but hard-boiled eggs just hit differently. This classic breakfast food got a workout during the Dust Bowl. Eggs were a valuable source of protein and could be stored for a longer time. Eggs, when hard-boiled, had a longer shelf life compared to raw eggs. This made them a practical choice for preservation, as they could be stored and used over time without spoiling quickly. Plus, boiling eggs is easy no matter how challenging the times get. They could be sliced into salads, added to casseroles, or simply enjoyed as a snack. These weren't just a breakfast item. These eggs were also used in dinner meals and were often served with white sauce over rice. If you ask someone to name one dish that describes diets during the Dust Bowl era, bean soup is the first meal that comes to mind. Beans have been man's best friend through some of the tensest times in history. They've been used in different kinds of meals through thick and thin. Bean soup was the classic bean dish of the 30s. Beans were cheap and easy to store, so they were a staple in many pantries. Bean soup could be made with any type of bean, and it was often thickened with cornmeal or bread. The simplicity of bean soup meant that it could be stretched to feed many people, and it provided a good source of protein and fiber. Bean soup might not have been the most exciting dish, but it was a staple of the Dust Bowl diet for a reason. It provided essential nutrition, was easy to make, and offered a bit of comfort and warmth. It was a reliable and nurturing meal that helped families get through some of the toughest times. Hoover's stew got its name from President Hoover, who was blamed for the economic hardship of the 30s. It was a hodgepodge of whatever ingredients you had on hand, thrown together in a pot and cooked until it was tender. It might have included meat, potatoes, carrots, and other vegetables, and was a way to use up leftovers. The hot dogs provided protein, the canned vegetables added some much-needed nutrients, and the pasta helped to bulk up the dish. Hoover's stew came about during the Great Depression in the early 1930s. Folks had to pinch a penny so hard they'd make Lincoln cry, as they used to say. This stew is a tasty way to stretch a dollar to feed more people or to make a meal with enough leftovers to take care of the next day's meals. Now, beans were a staple, and pairing them with ham was a Southern favorite. It was a hearty meal that would stick to your ribs. And let's be honest, who doesn't love a good bowl of beans and ham hocks? A variation of this was known as the United States Senate bean soup, or simply Senate bean soup, which was a soup made with navy beans, ham hocks, and onion. It was served in the dining room of the United States Senate every day, in a tradition that dates back to the early 20th century. The original version included celery, garlic, and parsley. One of the two versions used today includes mashed potatoes. The ham hocks added flavor to the beans, and the whole thing was slow cooked until the meat fell off the bone. It might not have been gourmet, but it was definitely satisfying. Imagine a world without fancy desserts or indulgent snacks. Well, that pretty much sums up the Dust Bowl era for you. Enter milk toast, which was one of the only sweet treats offered in the 30s. Milk toast was a breakfast dish consisting of toasted bread and warm milk, typically with sugar and butter. Some fancier variations included salt, pepper, paprika, cinnamon, cocoa, and raisins. Milk toast was a popular food throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, especially for young children. Now, This was the first choice for those feeling under the weather back in the day. Yeah, it was the classic sick people food of the Dust Bowl era. Often served with a pat of butter or a sprinkle of sugar, milk toast was a gentle food that was easy on the stomach. Turnip greens were a common green leafy vegetable during the Dust Bowl, when other greens like spinach and lettuce were a rare sight. I guess you can say crops had seen better days, so turnips were cooked down with a little bit of bacon or salt pork for flavor. During the Dust Bowl, these crunchy snacks took on a whole new role. Yes, they paired popcorn with milk back then, and it became the combo of our dreams. They were often cooked down with a bit of bacon grease or other fat to add flavor and make them more palatable. Whether served as a side dish, added to soups, or mixed into stews, turnip greens helped to round out meals and provide essential nutrients. Turnip greens might not be everyone's favorite, but they were a necessary part of the Dust Bowl diet. Last but not least, mulligan stew was the ultimate Dust Bowl survival dish. The Dust Bowl era was a time of scarcity, and people had to get creative with their meals. Mulligan stew was the epitome of this resourcefulness. It was a one-pot wonder, made with whatever ingredients were on hand. Meat, potatoes, carrots, and any other leftover vegetables could find their way into the pot. Mulligan stew might not have had a consistent recipe or flavor, but its purpose was clear: to provide a hearty, nourishing meal from whatever could be salvaged. So, which of these Dust Bowl foods would you have loved? Let us know in the comments. If you liked the video, give us a like and subscribe.